only spot where you need to use the hoe. She pushed the sandy reddish soil with the top of her foot as she walked and kept hacking at weeds along the way, trying the hoe on as if she couldn't help it. When we did get to Marutzi's plot, I simply started laughing. It looked all bad, really bad. The weeds were taller than the corn. Well, the corn that did come out sparingly, the dirt was rocky and hard, like a slab of concrete, and patrolled by angry ants who threatened to bite our feet, and they did bite our feet. We waited for Marutzi for a little while, and then we decided to start digging, since we came all the way here anyway. We'll do it for an hour or two, then go home. She watched me dig the weeds out clumsily and gently pointed out more efficient ways to do it, how to hold my body, how to cut the weeds instead of turning them upside down, which is what I was doing, kind of turning them back in, how to avoid hacking the corn, how to assess which corn might actually be better off hacked. Despite her back pain accumulated over years of digging, she was progressing faster than me and doing 3 rows instead of 1. I asked her what a day of digging meant, and she said about 12 hours of digging meant in the sun. In the meantime, Florina's 5-year-old showed up and watched us digging. Florina sent him back home to fetch her 2 teenage daughters, those mares, Viepelala, as she called them, to help us. They didn't show up, and we continued to dig in the sun, frustrated by the hard soil and the weeds. The girls later told me that they dug the family's land and are going to do their best to avoid digging anything else. Florina was digging furiously and commenting as if each hit was a demonstration of how bad the land was and how wretched the whole situation was. Florina, without her mares, quote-unquote, and Marutzi returned to the plot a few days later for a whole day of digging. I met them on the street later in the evening. Marutzi, frustrated but still cracking some jokes about it, was on her way to see somebody, a man who had a tractor and knew a lot about agriculture, to ask him if he would spray some herbicides on her corn. No, the answer was no. It was too late. She should have done it on time, which she didn't because she didn't have the money. Now she feared the money paid for plowing and for seeds was wasted. On our way back, through other people's corn and the brush and the lawn, Florina continued to use her hoe as if her hands couldn't help it. When we got to the red sand dirt at the edge of the hill, she punctuated every other step with a hit in the soft dirt. She stopped a couple of times and started digging the weeds out, spending her labor in a kind of generosity that baffled me. She was digging somebody else's land, and she did not owe them any labor. Such a pleasure to dig. This is good dirt. My mare drago sa sapă, ce pământ zic și eu. When walking on the lawn, whenever she saw a particularly good-looking weed, she would hack it with the hoe. Digging was in her body, in the memory of her muscles, as labor and knowledge and pleasure. It was the physical memory of all the digging done throughout her 50-year life. Digging her family's plot and other people's for pay, digging as she grew up in her mother's place at the cooperative or the state farm's orchard, so they could get more money as many other people did. Digging accumulated in her body as pleasure, as embodied knowledge, as pain, as matter. It made material her life experience. A middle-aged Romani woman born in this village and working to support her large family in this particular historical context. For Florina, digging accumulated in the layers that made her, symbolically and materially, a woman and poorer than others, and in her case, Romani. I use labor accumulation as a central trope to organize my analysis for this paper, as it allows me to see the body as the material site of articulation of what we call the biological, in quotes, and we can unpack it later, the social, the economic, and the political. Second, it helps me render abstract concepts like gender, class, ethnicity, race concrete, while maintaining respect for the complexity and the ultimate indeterminacy of human experience. In this village, at least with small exceptions, the women are the ones doing the digging. They expanded their socially reproductive labor in their household economies in a form that would normally count as productive, doing agriculture. Digging was planned and managed casually by women themselves through the normalcy of everyday life, sustaining involvement into a subsistence agriculture that made these families both resilient and cash deprived. The crops most favored were corn and potatoes, and not accidentally. These crops left open the option of a labor-intensive approach, if mechanization and use of various chemical aids was not affordable. To not have cash meant not using herbicides or a tractor, and above all, meant a whole lot of digging. Women's labor was a kind of unquestioned plastic surplus. It was expected to flexibly and tactically expand to fill in the gaps left by a lack of cash and by the debts and opportunities opened by participation in kin networks and small exchanges. As digging, women's labor was both sustaining the household economy and articulating it in graduated ways with the village one. At one end of the continuum, there were women who didn't need or were able to choose not to engage in digging. The priest's wives, teachers, the vice mayor's wife, those who owned large plots of land and practiced mechanized agriculture. Most, however, fell somewhere in the middle. They worked their own plots, sometimes hiring help or enlisting the help of relatives. Some used digging as a form of currency in a village economy that I already said was deprived of cash. Florina was repaying, in this case, Maruzzi for a freezer she received from her. Somebody was paying somebody else for medical services for giving shots. Somebody was paying somebody else for the use of some land right by her family. Some worked for cash as digging, along with harvesting and siting for men, was one of the few employment opportunities in the village. The Roma at the south end of the village, poor and landless, were the ones who looked like they would have benefited most from this employment. The older decades ago to the village precisely to perform this kind of highly physical and flexible agricultural labor, to serve as the same kind of plastic labor surplus for the cooperative and the state farm. Sometimes these people are called in to dig, but one day's pay, this year around 35 lei plus food, almost gets unnoticed at the end of the day. It buys a day's food for their large families and maybe goes towards repaying some part of their mounting debts at the local stores. However, their access to this kind of employment is limited. Only a handful are included in these arrangements, usually through long-term proven relationships. Instead, the ones digging for pay end up being the poorer of those living in the main part of the village, mainly because they belong to long-term networks that extend outside these employment relationships. So they might be relatives or neighbors, or might have something else in common. From afar, though, this very lack of access to employment on the part of the poorest of Roma is recast as choice, opting for not working, for being, quote-unquote, lazy. Most of the villagers, when explaining the poverty at the south end of the village, slide into a discourse of laziness and those gypsies deserving those wretched lives, to quote them, even though everybody knows very well that there isn't enough work to go around for everybody. The most I heard someone being employed for digging was 2 weeks, if she added up all the days worked in the season, certainly not enough to pull anybody, much less whole families, out of poverty. The morality of digging extended into policing womanhood as well. Women's digging was expected and assumed, and used as a measure of worthiness and as redemption. When a teenage girl's sexuality got a bit out of control, she was 15, and going out a little too much, and not coming back until, in the morning, her grandmother discussed the tragedy punctuated with, "Yeah, but she digs so beautifully." And when some neighbors were evaluating Claudina's 2 teenage daughters, they compared them to another of her older daughters who used to dig for pay in other people's garden. The name is certainly Merjash. One of the female teachers was bad-mouthed as never having held a hoe in her hand. As digging, the fruits of labor literally accumulated in the land, the corn, the potatoes, and further in the animals stock being fed. Just as digging accumulated in the body unequally, it also accumulated unequally in the land and the household economies that expanded it, revealing and reproducing another landscape of privilege and inequality. To have land and to have good land, along with the possibility of improving it through labor, was a mark, albeit modest for some, of privilege. In this situation, labor, digging, without owning or controlling the land, was not worth much. Bad land sucked in, consumed more labor, and yielded less. Maruzzi's plot, about 20 acres, was on the side of a hill and had rocky, poor soil, which made growing any crop an exercise in futility. Like many others, she did think about not working it at all, but the lack of cash to buy feed for her chickens and pigs kept pushing her back into working it. Land property, or the lack of it, is geographical distribution following the restitution process, produced and continues to reproduce an equally palpable social landscape. During the land restitution process, most villagers were allotted plots according to their political capital and their access to the commission deciding on the restitution, referring to the position, not necessarily the size. Certain families, not coincidentally the richest in the family, richest in the village, received flat, fertile plots and or bought the plots from other families after helping them receive similar fertile and flat locations. Some of the Roma at the south end of the village never received any land, as they were not entitled according to the law. They had never worked officially in full-time position in the cooperative or the state farm. Instead, as I've already mentioned, they were employed flexibly and paid by the day. The same inability to accumulate labor, this time on paper, brought them further poverty and marginalization through the added penalty of no retirement income. Digging becomes invisible as flexible, devalued, and expected work. Memoryless on paper, or in what we would call capital, becomes invisible as rural agricultural work, as subsistence work, and above all as women's work, leaving knowledgeable traces only on the bodies that expanded and the attached moralities and identities. Digging the material kinetic articulation of nature in women's bodies becomes an untraceable surplus, a free resource drawn into what Maria Mies had called ongoing permitted accumulation. Of course, the situation is not simple nor clear-cut when we place it in the context of the household or that of the larger economic system. Men also do this kind of flexible subsistence work, often, however, accompanied by animals or machinery. While labor migration to Germany, one of the main sources of cash in the village, is mostly gendered in favoring men, women are also an important, reliable, and respected source of cash as recipients of children's social assistance. In other words, we should not limit analysis to patriarchy and its working, or to questions of gendered economic dependence, which is somewhere we could be tempted to go. As I have already shown, this dynamic is also about class, ethnicity, or race, whatever you want to call it. I advocate a feminist economic analysis, and one that aims to ask questions of a broader scope of what and who this labor, digging, in this case, subsidizes as subsistence and as socially productive work, not just in the local, but also in the broader sense. Okay, so I'm done. Oh, questions? I haven't given you a lot of detail about the village, so I don't know. No questions? I'm just taking this.
Why did you choose
Digging? Oh yeah, I said in the beginning because I just heard a lot of talk about digging, so I thought
But
this
that
is
was
something.
only in the beginning of the summer. After that,
It was 2 months.
2 months.
It was the first digging, the second digging, was digging. Yeah, so I mean, I could choose something else. This is just, as I said, it's kind of, it allows me to give you a section of the reality.
But what were the conversation after the digging period? After you went further in the summer?
It was about weather, mostly kind of waiting to rain. And then now we're getting ready for corn. Well, now it's potatoes. August was about potatoes. It was digging potatoes, but it was a little different. Generally, more of the families involved, and it's more mechanized. So out in the field, we use mechanized using the horse.
You presented digging as more of a female activity. But if you were to think right now about the discussion with the men in the village, what were they talking about those times when the women were digging?
There was not a whole lot of talking to men during that time out in the public. And as you probably already know, men don't talk as much in the public. They were kind of out drinking, and I didn't go with them. So, yeah.
You go to the local market.
But yeah, I have next year to do that.
What sort of work did they perform, the men? Besides good work.
Well, a lot of what they do is, so they would, So you could call somebody with a horse and a plow to kind of help you digging. So it's a lot of the work that they do is using some tools that women are not, I don't even know if they're not allowed to use, or it's kind of assumed that they don't know how to use. Yeah, they don't often. I don't see them handling horses a lot. So during that time. But then there's sight, although women do participate in turning the hay and loading the hay. I mean, I've seen and heard women do that, so it's kind of a common activity, but the site is men.
Do they have, I know for example, messages in the summer that some of the people had smarter tools, you know, unmechanized, without tractors, but they had like a sort of thing that they would push, and it would be a sort of a hook, and it goes 10 times faster than the normal digging. Did you find
like a
this?
hand?
Like a sled. They just push it and then it goes really fast, and then it's really much more efficient than the normal.
Yeah, it probably depends on the dirt. This one, it was like this. It was really bad because of the drought. Yeah.
You didn't hear of anyone having this?
No, it was either like a horse or the corn was, I think, too tall for a tractor. No, you could probably do it with a tractor.
Did you perform the dig yourself? Right?
Yeah, and I was not very good at it. Although I thought I was really good because I've done it before, but not with corn.
But they didn't pay you for it.
No. I just insisted that I take part in it. They're like, sure. Yeah. Questions? Okay, well, thank you.
But I wanted to ask you something too. So are you very much inspired by phenomenology, or are you looking at, I was just thinking about sort of the embodied experience of digging. I mean, that could also be a road to take, or have you...
I mean, there was something, I mean, I included the scene, the vignette.
Yeah.
I can't quite reproduce what I kind of, like, not I experienced, but what I was seeing and feeling. Because this woman, she was tired, she was hot, she couldn't wait to get home, and then on her way back, she would stop and dig, continue to dig, like as we were going home. And whenever she saw, like I said, like a large weed, she was just like, oh yeah, and then she would just hack it. So I don't know, like that's kind of what gave me an idea, like what is it that's happening in the body, like how does digging accumulate? Yeah, so it's not, I mean, I'm more eclectic in my, I don't know what I do, like in terms of analysis, I kind of work with the material and see what I can come up with. I'm not very disciplined.
Okay, but I was just thinking that also that there's so much great literature in that regard that could, I don't know, yeah, it would be interesting.
Maybe she had OCD.
For me?
Maybe she had OCD.
No.
Maybe
She is kind of a.
I also was shown back to the idea of having a young or showing like a girl.
Sorry?
Yeah, the phenomenological literature, how it works and how gender is embodied.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that made me think about accumulation is this book, which is not a really good book, or it's kind of a moderately good book, but one that I really like. It's Mary's Mantle, can't pronounce her name. It's about gender, race, and ethnicity, and some class in the Andes. So she doesn't do any field work, but it's a lot of like secondary sources. And she talks about how race and class and gender, they do become biological in a sense through the body, because we live these identities. We live under these forces, and they become kind of internalized materially. So I think she gives the example of feet, and how these women, kind of these mountain women, working hard, fending for themselves, have these, I don't know, hardy feet, never have worn shoes. And it's just very interesting.